help walk alongside the indigenous peoples and communities, as well as how, the impact of colonization, residential school has, impacted the communities as well. And this is really related to what we've learned last week in terms of the effects of colonization and, the work that we do or we're learning today in the realms of harm reduction. So if we can just have a quick moment of reflection, that would be great. Okay, thank you. And I made a mistake earlier, and thanks, Colin, for letting me know. Actually, our core co-facilitators today is they are Colin and Ashley, not Samuel. Samuel and Adrian, our co-facilitators last week, are still with us. They are joining the meeting and will be providing, their insights as well. But we'll be hearing more from Colin and Ashley today. Welcome. First of all, we just wanted to provide an opportunity to ask all of you whether you had any questions about the topics we covered last week. So just a quick recap of session 1. We actually talked about the values and attitudes towards drug use, stigma and discrimination related to substance use and also people who use drugs, and the impact of drug policies on the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Do any of you may have any questions or comments about these 3 topics by chance?
I just want to, it's something to be clarified to me. When I was listening to the videos, I heard some references to residential schools. Yes. What does that mean?
Okay, so because we're in a co-learning environment, I'm wondering, is there anyone who can maybe speak on the residential schools, the history of the residential school system in Canada? Anyone? Brave takers?
Yeah, sure, I can do that.
Thank you, Colin.
Okay, so part of the policies enacted by the Canadian government to basically control the Indigenous population was that between the 60s and a little earlier, they actually pulled all children who were of Indigenous race or birth and placed them in schools that were run usually in the beginning by missionaries, church-oriented, and later by the federal government. What happened? So they literally went in and dragged these children out of their families, took them away. In some cases, the children did not return to their families for years. The problem with that and the ongoing issue with that is that those children were, well, first of all, they couldn't speak their own language in the school. They couldn't dance. They could not communicate with their families. They were literally cut off from their culture, their language, their beliefs. But what made it worse was that these children were abused physically, emotionally, and sexually. This has had great ramifications for a lot of the parents, because as I said, this was in the 50s and the 60s. So those parents actually who ended up having children, they brought all of that pain, that anguish, and that anger to their own children. So that is the continuing generational trauma that has affected this whole issue. The residential schools were terminated in the, I think, in the late 70s. Yeah, I think it was in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And what happened then, there have been court cases. So a lot of there were actually reparations made to those people who went through the residential schools. But the end result is that it has led to so many issues: drug use, substance use, bad lack of parenting skills, because I mean, they just didn't know this. So it was actually used by the government to basically assimilate, quotation marks, the Indigenous children. Yeah, that's a big simple encapsulation.
Thank you, Colin, for the explanation. Just a couple of clarifications. So the residential school system actually started kind of more, a little before the turn of the century, based on the, policies that Canada had, and actually the apartheid, system in South Africa was based on the residential segregation system that Canada had developed. So, there has been actually more than a few generations, about a century of like, genocide, kind of through policy that the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island have experienced. Colin, in terms of the 60 scoops you're referring to, that's actually when the, social services such as Children's Aid, they were actually taking indigenous children away from their family into, foster care, care under, non-indigenous, families as another way of, the genocide. So there's different kind of ways of how these racist policies still continue to play today. Wallace, thanks for your question. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, great.
Just listening to it is trauma. So I can just imagine what happens to the people who experienced it.
Yeah, thank you.
In some way, it has some similarities with Black people who went to the Caribbean too. It's not exactly the same, but there are similarities. Being uprooted from your culture and being forced to live and learn another culture without any understanding or connections with your usual culture,
Yeah, thanks, Wallace, for speaking
very
that.
Similar physically, but when it comes to culture, there is a lot of difference. The trauma of displacement that the Caribbeans face from the African perspective, we feel that it's really, really affected them badly, and it's something that from the Africans look at it as something that they haven't recovered from. Their own perspective may be different, but that's
Thank you, Wallace, for pointing that out. And I think later on, we actually would be discussing a bit more on this, in terms of harm reduction, and, like what's culturally relevant to our communities, given that, different communities may have different experiences as, settlers. And also the concept of indigenizing and decolonizing harm reduction. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat. So I thank you, Sam and Shaz, for your comments. Sam kind of reminded us, residential schools actually, the last one closed in the, I think, like 1990s. So, like it actually lasted for quite a while. I believe the last one was in the prairies, maybe in Saskatchewan. So today, for session 2, we're going to cover, 3 topics: drug and substance use 101, harm reduction philosophy and practice, and engaging people who use drugs. So this is the meat of the presentation. Just wanted to, I'm really glad that, agencies like you had reached out to ORN to express interest to learn about harm reduction, because actually we are experiencing a state of emergency, related to an unsafe drug supply. So in 2017, the Health Minister of Canada then said, announced the opioid crisis have actually surpassed the AIDS epidemic, in 2013. And, the opioid-related trends, oops, what did I do? The opioid-related trends in Ontario has risen consistently from 2003 onwards, and is still rising. As you can see the figures, the 2019 figures is, those are, sorry, Nick, are those estimates still?
So the 2019 numbers could still go up pending some outstanding coroner investigations, but what we do know is they just continue to go up every year.
Okay. So yeah, that's something for us to really, remember. So the coroner's report from the Ontario Chief Coroner's Office, so far in 2019, we have like 1509 opioid-related deaths. This is the slide we wanted to show you a little more. And, while a majority, according to this chart, a majority of the folks who experience opioid-related deaths are white, but you can see the different groupings of the racialized groups. The blue bar are figures from 2018. The red are 2019. So you do see a slight increase for, members of the Black community, for the Indigenous community as well. There's numbers for South Asian communities seems to be pretty even. A slight decrease in the Latin American community according to the data. But we also want to let you know that the coroner's office actually did not start collecting race-based data until quite recently. So, and if you actually look at the other and unknown columns, then we know that what we see on the left may not be 100% accurate. And I think there's been a lot of advocacy related to collection of race-based data around COVID, as you know how COVID really impacts marginalized communities significantly. So I think there's actually still much more we need to do around how accurate these data may be.
I think it's also just important to, these are deaths, but we know that there's a lot more non-fatal overdoses, and we're just looking at opioid deaths here. This doesn't include deaths for stimulants, and those are on the rise too. We've had a significant number of deaths related to methamphetamine, for example.
Great, thanks, Nick, for pointing that out. And this slide is the slide demonstrating the differences in gender groups. So, the lighter purple lavender is males and the darker purple is they're females. So, I think overall, more males, kind of pass from accidental opioid deaths. For the Indigenous community, the statistic is a little more closer between the gender. Okay, and then now we're going to get into the learning topic on drug and substance use 101. I know some of you have not, seen the video, and so I'm going to play just a little bit of this, so you get a bit better understanding of what the maybe effects of drugs may be. I won't be playing the whole video, but this is a pretty cute video. So where is, okay, share, just 1 second. How do drugs affect?
Christian, I don't hear the audio.
Can? You don't hear the audio?
No.
Can other people hear the audio?
No, it's because
No.
the hands-free.
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
No.
Can you hear now? No?
No.
Okay. We won't watch the video then. We tested this out earlier, actually, so I'm not sure why the video is not.
Take a while before the sound comes through.
Sorry?
I can try doing it.
Okay, sure.
Can you hear it on mine?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cam.
Yes.
Thank you, Cam.
Most Most people will take a pill, receive an injection, or otherwise take some kind of medicine during their lives. But most of us don't know anything about how these substances actually work. How can various compounds impact the way we physically feel, think, and even behave? For the most part, this depends on how a drug alters the communication between cells in the brain. There are a number of different ways that can happen. But before it gets into the brain, any drug must first reach the bloodstream on a journey that can take anywhere from seconds to hours, depending on factors like how it's administered. The slowest method is to take a drug orally, because it must be absorbed by our digestive system before it takes effect. Inhaling a drug gets it into the bloodstream faster, and injecting a drug intravenously works quickly too, because it pumps the chemicals directly into the blood. Once there, the drug quickly reaches the gates of its destination, the brain. The entrance to this organ is guarded by the blood-brain barrier, which separates blood from the nervous system to keep potentially dangerous substances out. So all drugs must have a specific chemical composition, which gives them the key to
You can stop it now.
and pass through.
Okay, great. Thank you. We weren't going to watch the video. You have the links to it if you want to watch more. I'm going back to the slides. That video actually is a pretty good, gives you a good primer of the effects of drugs. So let me go back to the...
While you're doing that, Christine, I'll just say I think it is important when we're working with people who use drugs to try and give them as much, empower them as much as we can. And for sometimes that's to understand the pharmacology of the drug and to understand why they might choose one route of administration or another. We'll talk about drug setting later. But that's why it's important to understand some of the science behind this.
So, those were like one of the learning objectives that some of the agencies actually identified as, areas of knowledge you want to gain in this training. So we recognize different agencies or participants may have different levels of understanding. So just, wanted to give everyone kind of like an even level of knowledge. Based on your understanding of drugs, can some of you perhaps name the main classes of drugs and the effects? Let me see where the chat. If not, then maybe we can actually have our co-facilitators, Ashley and Colin. Would you be able to provide some insights on this topic?
So one of the classes is depressants. One is stimulants. There's opioids.
Stimulants.
What's the other one? Psychoactive.
Psychedelics.
Yeah, psychedelics. Yeah, those ones are fun.
Or hallucinogens. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are the main classes of drugs. Like opioids would be part of the depressants along with alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And stimulants, maybe examples would be like cocaine, crystal meth, whereas opioids would be examples. Ashley, can you give some examples of the opioids?
Fentanyl, morphine, heroin, Dilaudid.
Lots of the painkillers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oxys.
And hallucinogens, actually, I believe the cannabis or marijuana is considered to be hallucinogens. So just
acid.
Yes,
yeah.
Mushrooms, magic mushrooms. So, just knowing the different types of drugs and the effects is quite important. Maybe I can just show you.
So I want to add something here, and I think it's important to get. So, I mean, we're going to get to the point where we talk about, I think it's important to understand that people use drugs for different reasons. Mm-hmm. Okay. When you're in pain, you're definitely not going to go take a stimulant because that's not going to work. Okay. So you're going to go for a painkiller. If I want to go out and dance, I go and I use ecstasy because, it gives me tremendous energy. I can just boogie on the floor for 5 hours if I want to get, and there are some drugs that, of course, we now equate with sex. So for example, meth, for example, cocaine, used to be. And of course, the whole Spanish fly story from way back when. So I think it's critical for us to understand when we're dealing with clients to understand what, I mean, not only what drugs they're using, but why they might be using those drugs. Okay, and that is key before in gaining that honesty and that understanding of what experience your client is going to come to you with. Okay, and I think this also helps in many cases. I mean, if your client wants to move to go to the point of getting off the drugs, again, it also helps to understand why they're using the drugs in the first place, so you can address those issues to help them in getting off the drugs if they so wish. So I think that's something that we have to put out here at the beginning. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colin. And then I think for folks who are not very familiar with the, different types of drugs or the effects, we did send out the drugs and effects wheel that you can take a look at, or a link to, the organization that produced this graphic for a more kind of accessible way to actually learn about the different types and effects of drugs. And then maybe...
Sorry, Christian, can I jump in quickly? I just wanted to
Sure.
say something, add on to something Colin said there in terms of we associate certain drugs with certain things. You said crystal meth and sex. I think it's important though to remember that some people associate crystal meth with sex, but not everyone.
Right.
People have different motivations for using, and for example, a lot of folks on the streets right now might be using crystal meth, and not in a sexual context, but because it suppresses their appetite and keeps them up for hours, and they don't sleep. So I think it's always important to remember people may use the same drug but for very different reasons, or they might start using it for one reason and be now using it for a different reason.
Yeah, and some people may, like the kind of hyper focus they get from certain stimulants, including crystal meth. So like it really depends on the in terms of substance use and the behavior, and sometimes it can be paired too. So those are things that we'll talk a little more later. Just want to throw out the question to the group. From your experience, what types of support do people who use drugs from your community seek from your agency?
Excuse me, please.
Yeah, sure.
I think that we also need to draw attention to that first video about addictions, which talks about the rat pack and the reasons why people actually use drugs compulsively. Because anybody can come in contact with a drug. It could be from a pharmacy, from a doctor, but why do certain people use it compulsively? And from my experience, when I actively use drugs, I realized, looking back and analyzing the situation, I realized that connections was a very big part of it, looking for people to connect with, having been in a new country where I did not have any connections, and also having things to fill up my life that I engage in was also a very big part of it. And I think that's an area we really need to look into as well when we are helping people who are actively using drugs or excessively using drugs.
And, thank you, Wallace. I think, that speaks to how sometimes people who use substances, if they do, are able to overcome the types of, societal stigma or internalized stigma, and they do reach out to you, like you might be, one of the few people they actually open up to talk about their use, right? So just being able to ensure that you're there, be able to understand and listening to them without kind of from a judgmental stance, that can make a lot of difference. Okay, so just a brief, quick review of how drugs actually affects the person. So you have the different types of drugs, the set, we talk about drug set and setting. So the set usually refers to the person. So it depends on the, conditions of the person, where you're at, how you're feeling, whether you've developed different levels of tolerance for certain drugs. And then in terms of the set and setting, that means where you're taking the drug. So an example would be if a person is actually taking, a drug in a supervised injection site versus if someone is actually using in a dark alley, their effect of the how they feel about the drug may be different. Another example would be maybe people who may use ecstasy at a dance party. If they use it at the big warehouse dance party versus using it at a home party, the effects might be different. I'm not sure if everyone had kind of been able to visit a supervised consumption site, but maybe we can just take a very quick look at this video. Kim, can you play this since it seems like I have like a sound issue on my end. And this is a very short video of a supervised consumption site in Vancouver. It's called Insights. It's Canada's first supervised consumption site. You need to turn on the sound. Yeah.
Well, welcome to Insight. Folks are going to come in through this door here, and they're going to walk up the ramp and into our waiting area. They're going to tell the staff their code name and what they're here to do. If it's use the injection room, see about detox, see a nurse, anything else. That staff will enter them into the database, and if they're using the injection room, they'll hang out for a bit in our waiting room. We've got a sink here so people can wash their hands while they're waiting. Hygiene's really important. There's not much running water in the alleys. So eventually, someone will call your name from the injection room that we're looking at here, and you'll be ushered in. You'll tell the staff what substance you're using, and you'll be given a booth to use in. You'll note that this doesn't look like a clinical space. It looks more like a hair salon. So over here we have the nursing station. It's on a raised platform, and it's got crash kits, oxygen tanks, and injection supplies on top. There's also a treatment room just off of the IR if people need wound care, if they need point of care testing or anything like that. Then when you're done with the IR, you can come into the post-injection room, which we call the chill-out lounge. And here you can drink juice and coffee and just hang out and stabilize. And if you wish, you can talk to somebody in this office about getting up into detox or getting housing and shelter. We do about 400 detox admissions a year, so it's a great place to access care. And then after you're done having your juice, coffee, talking about detox, you exit through this door, which is only a few feet away from the entrance door. So the place is basically shaped like a horseshoe. It's been a very good design for us. Cheers.
Great, thank you so much. So that's just a quick, overview of what a supervised consumption site may look like. And we have a few in Toronto.
So we're asking Canadians to buy local and spread the word.
Okay.
Just by watching this video.
Kim, can you
stop the sound?
Learn more at Go Canada.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, before you go on, Christian, I want to go back to the drug set and setting thing because okay, so I also think you went over it, but I also think we need to also understand that when it comes to the person, you also have to look at issues such as their housing, their mental health state, critical what's the other thing I wanted to, mental health state, financial situation, because it makes such a major difference in using a substance. When my friends come over to use drugs at my place, everybody has their own little area that it's theirs for the evening, which is so much different from going anywhere else, because you're with friends, you're taken care of, you don't have to worry about the police breaking in, etc., etc. So that whole mental attitude and psychological state is so key to basically enjoying or making the enjoyment of the drug far more easy. And I just want to touch on the issue of whenever we see the press or the media show abuse or bad drug use, it's rare that they show you a picture of 4 people sitting around in a living room with snorting coke through $100 bills. Generally speaking, it's always the people in the alleyways or on the thing. The big thing here is that the majority of the population uses substances and has no issues. And it's tied back to their setting, the drugs that they're getting, which tend to be far better quality than is usually available on the street, which is critical, and of course where they are. They're at somebody's home. So I just want to tie that into the whole concept of drug use. Okay.
Yeah, I
Thank you,
think
Colin.
it's,
Yeah.
I'll just add, it's as we're working with people who are using drugs, this is a really interesting concept to look at, and you can think about where they may be able to make changes in order to improve their experiences or reduce their risks. So is it something about the actual drugs that they're doing, or is it something about just their mental health right now, or is it like changing up the environment as Colin was talking about? So
Great.
I
Thank you.
just wanted to mention about the certain setting again. The supervised places
Mhm.
are few and far between, first of all. And secondly, for people who are using drugs for perhaps the reason behind it is sex, those supervised places might not actually be able to be of much help.
Yeah.
And secondly, and then I think it's also very important the people, the how comfortable you feel in the environment where one uses drugs. Is it with friends? Is it with strangers? Is it with people who have a sense of authority over you that you may be afraid of? Or is it with people you are really comfortable with that you can relax? I think that affects the whole experience and the outcome of the use.
Those are excellent points, Wallace, and it's important to note too that if you look at the data Christian was showing earlier around the opioid deaths, we know that 75% of them are happening in people's own homes. So these are people that are probably not going to go to an injection site because they have their own space to use already.
Right.
So we need to look at other strategies and other safety things there. So
Yeah.
So yes,
lots of
so I'm just going to add something else here. So I don't know if anybody know what peep shows are, but there are a couple of them on Young Street and there are a couple on Church Street, and they are used by a lot of street people to indulge in substance use and sex. It's basically a sort of a controlled area, but it involves porn movies. You're in a room type situation. So a lot of people do use those areas. So this is something that might come up in your conversations. Okay.
Thank you so much, Colin. I think, like for those who want to know where the, supervised consumption sites are located in the city. So there's one at Regent Park Community Health Center. There's one at Street Health, which is like close to Regent Park Community Health Center on Dundas East. There's, one at Parkdale, Queen West Community Health Center, St. Stephen's. Yeah, and the Works is, probably the most centrally located one. And, based on my experience when I was able to, speak with some of them. Oh, also the Moss Park, overdose prevention site as well. I would ask, do you see any kind of racialized folks coming? And then, the staff usually they would say, well, probably not a lot. And I think that kind of speaks to the potential stigma of why people may not be accessing these services. And we need to really be creative in terms of thinking how we can actually better support the needs of folks who may be injecting. So that's just one point I want to add.
Yeah. Take note that there are none in Scarborough and there are none at Jane and Finch or in any area that is primarily people of color. So I think that's something that we also need to look at and examine as to and question as to why. Okay.
Thank you.
I think it's also important to note that there's online virtual services or over the phone overdose prevention services that people can access as well.
Thank you, Ashley. So maybe if you can speak about these services, I think some of the online ones would be called more peer witnessing kind of initiatives, or phone lines would be, ones where folks can call in and there's a society in Hamilton that's called Granville Ministries. That's anyone from the province can actually call in when people want to use. And what happens is, they assess folks, and if, they don't, they kind of know that someone is experiencing an overdose, they would just call the ambulance and emergency services. So, hopefully lives can be saved. I'm going to go through some slides very quickly. The drugs, the routes of administration, you know, the video kind of already talked about how some of the drugs can be, you know, be administered through the body. And then, you know, depending on how you do it, injection, smoking, snorting, whooping, or like booty bumping, which is the term of if you like, you know, take drugs through your rectum, or swallowing, it takes different times for someone to feel the effects, and the duration of the drug can last, you know, across the spectrum as well. Colin, you talked about, you know, like a spectrum of use earlier. So, you know, there are people, I think, you know, majority of folks who use drugs, they, you know, may be using for beneficial use or casual use with that are not considered problematic use. And then there's a spectrum of people who use drugs who do develop problematic use or chronic dependence. So I think that's something for us to really recognize, that when we talk about drug use, people are using drugs for certain reasons, and a lot of them they're using for beneficial reasons as well. Nick?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I want to just, you'll notice the language here is a spectrum of drug use. It used to be that we used to talk about the continuum of drug use, but I think people are moving away from that, because the continuum implies that you automatically move from beneficial to casual to problematic to chronic. And that may be some people's journey, but not everyone does. It's not always a straight line. Not everyone moves into problematic use. So we tend to try and use the word spectrum these days, and that people can be different at points and move back and forth across it. And it's not always just a straight line and automatic path that people take.
Thank you. Next slide. So stages of change as well. When we talk about, you know, substance use, and, you know, perhaps you see service users, they may be coming to you because they have concerns about their substance use. But at the same time, you know, I think a lot of you may know about the stages of change, but for those of you who don't know, you know, like a person must become ready, you know, to kind of change their behaviors, right? So I think it's just being able to support the person where they're at. You know, are they actually not even thinking about their substance use? They don't think they have an issue. Are they already thinking about their drug use in stage 2? That's the contemplation stage. Maybe they're more ready to change. So it's in the 3rd preparation stage, the action stage, and 4 is where they're actually actively, you know, making changes to their substance use. And then maintenance stage would be where they have already kind of maybe changed the behavior, and they're just maintaining their current goal around substance use. And just it's also important to recognize that this is not like, you know, a linear kind of a model. So if someone is in one particular stage, they can just very easily go, you know, back and forth between different stages as well. Nick, I saw your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just think it's just really important to remember this part, and when we're working with people, to recognize where they're at in terms of this process, because if we come in at the wrong stage, we set people up for failure, or they turn us off. So if someone hasn't even thought that they might want to change their behavior in any sort of way, and we come in saying this is what you should be doing, they might just turn away from us. So it's really important that we think about how ready are people to hear what we have to offer, and maybe sometimes we don't get to talking about certain things because they're just not ready to hear about it yet. We got to build that trust and relationship first.
Yeah, and Colin, you raise your hand?
Yeah, so the other little thing I want to add here is that, and to add on what Nick just said, is, you know, celebrate the victories, no matter what they are. So for example, somebody who has not been able to make appointments, you know, and makes a change and actually makes one appointment on time, celebrate that with them. You know, don't look like, you know, oh, you didn't make, you know, you missed 4, you know, but here you are type situation. It's those small little victories that help in the journey. And it's so key, I think, in understanding that, you know, for some people, they might need to get high to actually get up to make that appointment. Okay. And this is something else that I think we make issue with. Like so many of our agencies, you know, say you can't come in high, you can't come in, you know, under the influence of drugs. We can't do that. that does not work. So that person might need to have that hit to get up in the morning to come and face people. Okay, so I think it's really crucial in this whole stages of behavior change that we understand that and understand what it means to them to actually be able to get up out of their bed to come in for that appointment. Okay.
Thank you, Colin. And that's a good segue to talk about, our conceptualization of addiction, right? So I know, Wallace, you actually referred to this video earlier and you recapped beautifully about this. For those of you who are familiar with the rat park experiment, it really talked about how isolated rats, they would tend to drink themselves with, water laced with, I think, heroin to death, because they don't have any interactions with the social world or others. Whereas, for rats who lived in spaces where they have other, rats to play with and lots of, kind of toys and obstacle courses, they actually thrive. And even if they are offered water with heroin, they actually won't be drinking that. So, if you haven't watched this video, definitely encourage you to watch it. It's on your pre-activity slides, pre-session activities. And the end of this video, it just really recapped what Wallace said. A lot of times, if not all people, but some people, if they do have develop chronic dependence or problematic use, is the counter of addiction as a societal problem is actually making connections with others. So as a service provider, are you actually able to make that connection with your service user who is using substances? Okay, next slide. Just wondering.
Christian.
Yeah.
I was just going to add.
Yes.
Yes, what do you call it? Sorry, it escapes me now.
It's okay. When you're able to, you can jump in.
Okay.
Okay, sure. In the meantime, I think we'll skip over some of the questions around addiction, because I'm not sure how everyone has.
Sorry, the stages of use.
Stages of use.
Yeah, stages of change. Sorry.
Right. Okay.
First thing I want to say is that first of all, I think that drugs should actually be legalized so that it makes it easier for people to manage their use. And I understand that most people will not have, but for the people who have problematic use, and I think that sometimes it is difficult for the person in the situation to recognize that they have developed a problem and they can't see it because they are inside the situation themselves. That's number one. And then number two, I think another thing that workers have to be aware of is post-acute withdrawal syndrome, which for people who have decided to make a change about their substance use, it makes it difficult for them to maintain that goal that they have desired to keep because of the nature of post-acute withdrawal syndrome itself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Wallace. Those are definitely very relevant points to think about. I think, someone who may be quite deep in the, problematic use and dependence, they may not be very aware of how the impact of the substance may be impacting them. But I think also a lot of times people who use drugs are quite aware of, how the effects, the benefits, and the I guess the the not so good sides of substance use, because there are the benefits and the what's the word against benefits? I can't think right now. The risk, right, or challenges like that comes along with substance use as well. So thank you for sharing, Wallace.
Christian,
yeah.
I don't know, this just made me think about a couple sessions that we've held inside prisons, like male federal prisons with PASAN.
Yeah.
And we did quite a bit, like a few workshops around like harm reduction and like risk-related behaviors or sexual health or whatever over the last few years. And the last time we were in there, it was something that was more led by Passam, but it was more just like a circle like of men sharing their experiences about, you know, wishing that there was like safer consumption sites in there, wishing that, you know, they weren't going to face further charges if they were caught, and, you know, that kind of thing. And this one young man, I think he was like in his early 20s, he shared like a really personal story about his overdose and how scary it was, and how he was, it almost felt like an intervention in that moment, because he was sharing with a group of like close to 20 people about like how scared he was of that happening again, but still wanting to be able to use safely. You know what I mean? And that was like a really powerful moment. Like, it sat with me. It really sat with me to hear him speak about just like how scared he was of overdosing, but yet just wished that there was like a safer way that he could use, you know?
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that, Mary.
No problem.
I mean, within the prison system, you know, like depends on whether you're on the provincial system or the federal system. There are like different access to, you know, like harm reduction supplies as well, right? We know that within the provincial system, much less services that you can actually gather. And, you know, for you, if you have gone to done outreach with Passant, you would have known that, you know, sometimes even substance use could potentially be, you know, or getting condoms is like a taboo topic, right? So, and sometimes when people actually want to access, you know, safe harm reduction supplies, they can't do it in a confidential manner. They have to maybe line up to see a nurse, and then everyone may know that, you know, they're doing, you know, they're engaging in certain behaviors that they're not supposed to. So there are lots of considerations to think about how we can support people within the prison system as well. Yeah.
For sure. Lastly, I remember hearing some guys state that, you know, when some of their cellmates would overdose, they'd literally turn a blind eye because they didn't want to also get charged. You know what I mean? Like, so oftentimes, like, trying to access that support can be dangerous for you, like on so many different levels as well, right?
Yeah, thank you, Marie. And then also, you know, like we heard of cases where, you know, like a correctional services staff, you know, witnessing overdoses and they're not really, you know, like administering naloxone or calling for, you know, EMS either. So I think it is a very critical issue that needs to be addressed. And I think that ties also into the stigma and the types of like discrimination that people who use drugs face. Thank you for sharing that story. It's so powerful, and really glad that the gentleman was able to share his, you know, lived experience with his group of peers. So thank you. Nick, did you want to say something?
I'm gonna ask Ashley. I'm gonna put Ashley on the spot here, but totally okay if you don't want to, Ashley. But I'm wondering if you, just from your experiences, either personally or seeing friends, you could just touch a little bit on what it's like to experience withdrawal from opioids. We were just touching on that there.
Okay, so I don't know. It's like hell. I don't know how else to describe it. Like it's physically debilitating. You go through like. In my opinion, opioid withdrawal is more physically debilitating, whereas stimulant withdrawal is more emotionally debilitating. So for me, and for the people that I work with, I find that medication is really the only way to deal with withdrawal from opioids. Like in a safe way, I'd say. You just get like really sick, nauseous, like your bowels loosen, you just like you're really cold one minute, hot the next, you can be throwing up all the time, like it's just very debilitating. So I think like medication is the best way to deal with it.
How long does it go on for?
It depends. Like my doctor told me recently that day 3 and day 5 are the worst for people. So that's what she sees in her safer supply program. So I think like probably it would go on for a week. I hear people say that it goes on sometimes for 2 weeks. So, and to get medication at a level where it's actually working sometimes takes that long. So it can be very, very hellish. And like your clients who are going through withdrawal are probably not gonna attend appointments or want to come in to do like goal setting or therapy. Like it's just not gonna happen, I don't think. So it's important to keep that stuff in mind.
Thanks.
Thank you. So thanks, Ashley. And I think, that ties into, the availability of a safe supply as well, right? And, like we know that the, supply has not been safe. So we've been witnessing the amount of opioid related deaths. But also, recently we are aware that, the related to crystal meth, the supplies in the, the city or the country is kind of dwindling too. Like, so if we're supporting people who are using substances and we know that there's a shortage of supply, how can we support them? And the Gay Men's Sexual Health Alliance actually produced certain good tip sheet that you can like look at their Facebook page to access and providing tips to support queer men who may be engaging in chemsex using crystal meth. For people who use opiates, I think just having understanding kind of healthcare providers who are able to support you with that opioid antagonist therapy maintenance. So like methadone or Suboxone.
Can I say something else too as well? Recently, with the supply being all mixed up, I'm seeing a lot of people actually have like benzo withdrawals with opioid withdrawals. So they're getting like double whammied, and the medications for opioid assisted therapies aren't really addressing their withdrawal, and they're wondering why. So maybe that's like something that people can keep in mind if their clients are going through something like that.
Yeah, so Ashley, can you maybe speak a little bit about the benzodiazepines as well? Because like I think we talked about like stimulants, opioids, like depressants, but like how are those withdrawals like? When, let's say, if someone you do a lot of work and you have administered a lot of like naloxone to revive folks who may experience overdose, like what would happen in that case if someone took a batch where the supply also is laced with benzos?
So sometimes they're not waking up, right? Like it's creating like their breathing is not like, it's depressed. So I guess like they're not, the naloxone isn't waking some people up. The benzodiazepines, when it comes to the withdrawals for that, it's very emotional and like heady. Like you get like headaches and very like disoriented and dizzy, and you're not right. That can take about a week to get over. But it's very dangerous because you can go through like seizures. Recently, I lost a girlfriend to a seizure that she went through withdrawal, had a seizure, and then died, right? So like there's a lot of other things that can happen as well, besides just death. But there's, like it's a big problem out there, and it's more prevalent now that COVID has been impacting the drug supply.
Right. Thank you for sharing that, Ashley, and really sorry about the loss as well. And like these losses could be preventable. And it is really kind of a systemic and structural neglect of the support that people can, who use drugs are they're eligible to access. safe healthcare, but it's just a result of government neglect. So thanks for sharing that, Ashley. I think
it's really interesting.
Yes,
it's really opening up the knowledge about drug use to all of us, so that we don't look at it as something that is for bad people who hide in corners. And drug use, I really hope that one day drugs will be legalized, so that people can, so that a lot of the heavy weight that people carry on their shoulders concerning drug use, guilt and fear, is removed, because it's really impacts, it causes people to go to this end of the spectrum where it's excessive and dangerous.
Right. Yeah.
Well, the police chiefs of Ontario put out a letter to Justin Trudeau, like calling for decriminalization of drugs. So hopefully, with like certain movements, that will be possible one day.
Yeah, let's definitely hope so. And I think, like seems like the government, Health Canada, is doing some community consultations as well regarding, their drug policy. So, but I think people need to actually send a letter in, so they didn't make it easy for community folks to send in their feedback, comment. Okay, so I think maybe we'll just restart the
I just wanted to say, Christian,
yeah, sure. Yeah.
I'm giving out harm reduction packs to people. And from my community, the reaction I get from Africans is that I'm encouraging people to have random sex and to use drugs. And this really affects the whole harm reduction drive, because if people will not access harm reduction tools, then it becomes really dangerous. And also, I find that the knowledge about drugs too is something that not every drug user has.
Right. So I think, thanks, Wallace, you touched on a really good point. So that's why, I think like working within different communities, we must really know our community, find a way to kind of start difficult conversations. And I think, you all have that expertise, right? Talking about sexual health to your own community members, finding ways to actually bridge that conversation into harm reduction and substance use as well.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Yeah. This is all new for me. This is Helen.
Hi, Helen.
It's really an eye-opener for me. I worked in a sector before where you have to come in there clean and sober. So this is really interesting, and it's a new way for me to understand better what the clients who I worked with for 12 years, what they actually probably went through. So thank you for this opportunity, because it's a very big eye-opener for me. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. And I think it's the work that we do, like it's continuous, right? So like if we can actually also let other members of your community know, your colleagues, your former colleagues, maybe even just kind of change some of their attitudes and values, that may even be better, because I think harm reduction is really beautiful philosophy, but we're going to actually start and talk about, okay, what is harm reduction? It's also, like a movement that was led by people who use drugs. And a lot of you have kind of heard of the saying, nothing about us without us, sort of like the Chipa Mipa principles. This is the same for, people who use drugs. They were the forefront of the movement, and a lot of the programming and services that exist today started because of people who use drugs. And you can see the types of interventions that people who use drugs kind of led: needle exchange in the 70s, 80s, crack pipe distribution in the 80s and 90s, drug checking at raves in the 90s, naloxone distribution to counter the opioid overdoses in the 2000s, and then recent year drug consumption sites. And now I think there's this really passionate talk amongst folks about safe supply. How can we ensure that people who use drugs can have access to safe and unadulterated, unsafe supplies, so they don't have to, experience overdoses.
Can I add something here,
yeah.
Christian?
Yeah.
So I was one of the lucky people to have been involved with the works when it was first created way back in the 70s. I was one of the original ambassadors. And, we've come a long way. To give you an example, way back then, one of the reasons that it came up was because of the HIV thing. That was really what precipitated needle exchange in many ways. It was to prevent the transmission of HIV. But things were so screwed up back then that we literally had a letter signed by the chief of police and the director of public health stating that we were allowed to actually have needles on us as well as have clean needles on us. The reason being that when we got stopped by the cops, I mean, you have a bag of like 200, used needles. The cops would, half the time they wanted to arrest you. Mm-hmm. So you needed that letter to sort of show that you were permitted to have this paraphernalia on you. So I think, so we have definitely come a long way. That being said, with the African, Caribbean, and Black populations, I think one of the issues that we need to look at is historically our mechanisms for dealing with substance use. And again, okay, let me stop there. First of all, we don't acknowledge in many ways that there is substance use in our communities. And in many cases, we still don't. Mm-hmm. That's still something that we hold as saying, no, it's a white thing. We don't really do that. Or the other alternative that we use is that if you use drugs, the reason you're using drugs is because you're not going to church often enough. Thanks. And I think we have to start from that outlook in dealing with how we're going to change the attitudes related to harm reduction within BIPOC communities. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Colin, for saying that. And, when you mentioned church, which is a strong, component of many folks in the, Black African Caribbean community, and, it's really thinking about maybe how can we work innovatively and, work potentially with that community can, there might be some more progressive churches who may have church leaders who are willing to actually talk about this. We know, that has been done within the sexual health HIV sphere. So how can we actually maybe move that towards substance use too? Not an easy task for sure. I think maybe Ashley, actually, are you there? Because I think what Colin said actually kind of, I remember you kind of talk about is interesting. There are different considerations you need to have when you work with the indigenous communities as well. Did you want to touch on that?
Well, yeah, because of colonialization and the fact that like alcohol was given to our peoples in order to steal our land and all that fun stuff. I think because of that history, there's a pushback from the indigenous community to there's more of like an abstinent based lens when I deal with indigenous folks, and especially like elders and like the older generations. So I think like because of colonialization, we have to like break through some of that. And the video that you had about indigenizing harm reduction, right, that was actually very beautiful, and that explained it beautifully, like how it's like going through a river. You go through, you want to get to the end, which is sobriety to some people, but along the way you kind of go through your own path, and you take your own steps through the river, and it's kind of cool how they describe that. And I think like that's a beautiful way to explain how harm reduction and indigenous cultures can mix together. But I also there's a lot of pushback because of the history of colonialization. So I think maybe when engaging indigenous folks who are more about sobriety or abstinent based models, I think you can just explain that aspect of it. Like you can liken it to the culture and the attitudes and the traditions that indigenous people have, and a lot of them are very similar to harm reduction philosophies. So I think that's important to push through when you're coming across some of those barriers, because there's so much history and so much issues with that, with colonialization. I think it's going to take a lot of teaching and education, and yeah.
Yeah, so actually, since you touch on that, you said, like there's a lot of similarities between indigenous cultures and harm reduction. Let's maybe like talk about what is harm reduction, and then talk more about maybe this cultural aspect of it. Because I think, like we have a diverse group of community members here, but I'm sure that, many of the participants may have thought, oh yeah, like how can we actually like incorporate that cultural relevant piece, our traditions in the work. So maybe people in our communities can actually understand this concept a little better, or relate to the, the harm reduction philosophy better. So harm reduction, I think a lot of you know what it means, like it really is reducing harm, right? A lot of you have worked in the HIV sector, reducing harm, such as, maybe HIV sector, maybe using like a safer sex kind of interventions, condoms, U equals U, PrEP, but, like every day we actually reduce harms as well, right? Like, not eating as much sugar or exercising. But I think what Ashley said was, there's this like similarity between, harm reduction and indigenous kind of cultures. And I think part of it is about like caring for others, right? This collectivist, right? Collectiveness. And I love this slide because it talked about how harm reduction programs are often the first and only contact that people, who use drugs have with health and service providers, but it's about the concept of having this hand reaching out and connecting with the other person. How can we actually make that initial connection? And, like Donald McPherson of the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition says, harm reduction is about building relationships and deepening those relationships, right? So are we actually, supporting, the people where they are at, and, allowing them to make their own decisions, and, hopefully be able to support them to meet their needs.
I think this really ties back into last week too, in terms of the stigma and how pushed to the margins many people are, right? So this is about bringing people back in, and maybe in some indigenous cultures, that's bringing people back into that circle, and for other communities, making people part of a community again.
Yeah, and sometimes like rebuilding that trust, right?
Yeah.
As Nick said.
So Leah, let me add something here.
Yeah.
And I think, okay, so I'm going to be realistic here. So you mentioned PrEP, you mentioned condom use. So I think let's understand, we're all ASOs here, and we understand that one of the realities in our communities is that the groups that HIV rates are rising, and the groups that are having a lot of issues with substance use are indigenous and Black groups. Okay. The question here is why? Why is this happening? And I'm gonna throw it out there that it's arising for the same reasons that we're not using PrEP. Condom use is not really pushed as much as it should be, and these are crucial issues. So if we're not even accepting and using harm reduction on something as basic as condom use, the question we need to ask is why. And Ashley spoke to it earlier. The whole issue, and it comes back, in my personal opinion, to that whole colonization thing. And so we cannot address harm reduction in our communities unless we address the issue of colonization. The next thing I want to point out is that we actually do have harm reduction concepts, but not in the concepts as the mainstream uses it. So for example, I come from Jamaica. Alcohol and weed are our big things. And I think somebody mentioned last week that there were also the similar things in many African countries. But I mean, who's going to OD on weed? Okay, you're going to get some psychosis. Alcohol, if you saw somebody drunk on the street, you called his family, he came and picked him up. Okay, so we had a societal concept of dealing with harm reduction, which is so different from what we have in Canada, where it's an organizational thing. I think the other thing that we need to understand, and this is done so often in North America, is that African, Caribbean, and Black groups are treated as one homogenous group, which we aren't. Okay, a Jamaican is quite different from an American Black, who is quite different from somebody from Nigeria. Okay, there are language issues, there are cultural issues, musical issues. All of these things need to be addressed for us to seriously tackle and understand how to change harm reduction to a community-based model for us. And I think that we keep going around it in so many ways, but we're not pointing out how we're going to be able to do that. And the reality is, we need to start involving more family groups, more community organizations, but we also need to change the concept of harm reduction as it applies to African, Caribbean, Black, and Indigenous groups. Okay,
Right.
and that lens can only be done when we look at the issue of colonization and the laws that were imposed on so many of our ancestors to bring us to this point. I mean, why are people using drugs now in let's say the Indigenous community? I was speaking with somebody a couple of days ago, a young man who came from Nigeria, and he was telling me that one of the reasons, he's gay, one of the reasons that he started using substances here was, and I think somebody else mentioned it, was for that sense of belonging. But the drugs he's used to back there and the drugs he's used to here are two different things. I mean, he ended up going to a PNP party, and for everybody who doesn't know, a PNP is party and play. It's now a sort of a major thing in the LGBTIQ and actually mainstream society, where you use drugs to have sex. He ended up going to a PNP party, not realizing what he was getting into. By the time it was finished, he had sex with people who he did not know, in some cases without a condom. And the next thing he knew he was literally out on the street with his clothes in his hands. So these are some of the realities, and we have to look at these things to get a hand on what is going on in our community. And our organizations need to appreciate this and speak openly about what is happening. If we're going to keep talking, in back rooms and stuff like that, then you're not going to build the trust of the people who you want to come and get services.
Thank you, Colin. And I think, you speak about, the differences between mainstream harm reduction programming services and then maybe like the need for, like our communities or agencies kind of supporting ethnocultural and indigenous, communities to really develop these more appropriate types of harm reduction programs and supports, either through indigenizing the, practices, or decolonizing the practices. Ashley, yes.
Also, too, with harm reduction, there's a level of honesty that's required to have this relationship and this rapport. And in the Indigenous community, especially, I've noticed there's like a lack of honesty about what's really happening. And like my grandmother and grandfather, for example, are so quick to push those drug use and those negative issues under the rug and act like they're not happening. And I think in order to address the issues, we need to actually like be more vocal and change that part of the community.
Mm-hmm. And I think that also ties back to what you said about maybe certain generations of indigenous people. They may be more pro abstinence, and as either as an act of resistance, or maybe they weren't feeling safe to actually speak the truth when they were young too, right? Like having to go to residential schools. So many factors to really consider, and like we must kind of consider the history of how people actually from our communities got here, years ago, the types of, maybe injustices and discrimination that they had faced or continue to face. And then actually what may be some of these like culturally relevant topics to start that, difficult conversation. So I don't have the answers to it all. I think, as Sam actually noted, we need to hire experts. So, consider agencies, consider hiring drug culture experts, people who, with living experiences who use drugs, because they are the experts and they know how to, reach out to people who use drugs. And a lot of times they actually are the first ones to know, if there are changes in the drug supplies and what's the best way to respond to overdoses or whatnot, right? Or to support their peers as well. So
there wouldn't be harm reduction programs without peers, basically.
Exactly. And I think, we are touching on a good topic. I actually wonder if people want to talk more about, indigenizing harm reduction or decolonizing harm reduction, or do we want to actually start talking about, ways to engage people with living experiences of who use drugs too? Because I think there are considerations to do that. I think, folks on this call, they're aware how to engage people living with HIV/AIDS. But when you talk about engaging people who use drugs, sometimes there could be different considerations as well. So maybe I'll skip the slides.
So no, hold on, before you jump on there. So okay, so I mean, I think everybody sort of gets an idea of what harm reduction is. It's it's non-judgmental. It comes from the client. And people who use drugs, which are very important. The practices and programs are basically aimed at reducing the harms. Now, abstinence, which used to be considered to be something that was in opposition to harm reduction, isn't. Abstinence is a harm reduction, but that is the mechanism some people need to control their drugs. It's also educational. People, one of the major facets of harm reduction is that people understand and know their drugs. They know where to go to seek assistance for their drugs. It doesn't encourage or enable drug use. That's a whole lot of crap put out by the right wing and all of those religious yahoos. Okay. It understands that everybody is different. Okay. It also, and I think this is also key with you, Sean, it's also crucial to understand that people use substances for different things. So, I mean, that's basically the most part. It's also holistic in its viewpoint, in its sense. It looks at the person, their setting, where they are, who they are, their, social economic bracket. All of these things to be taken into account. Okay. And I think that's important. Okay. But the other key thing, and this is on the slide, is that it also says that drugs aren't good or bad, okay? And, we know that, okay? I have been doing substance. I came out in 1972 as a young gay man in Toronto. And let me tell you, one of the most important things that I learned was that I learned all my drug use I was mentored. And I want to touch on this because I think this is important for the African, Black, and Caribbean population. Especially the LGBTIQ. In the 70s, we had 30 odd bars here. Okay, substance use is a big and crucial part of the LGBTIQ community. Okay, lesbian and I mean everybody. But what happened was that the way we learned about drugs back then was your elders. They were the ones who, you know, when the first time I dropped acid, you know, I was at a bar and somebody said, "You ever done this?" No. They broke it in half, gave it to me, told me what I should expect, blah blah blah. I danced for like 5 billion hours, you know what I mean, sort of thing. So that was key. There was that element of mentorship within our community. AIDS did more damage to us than we acknowledge, especially in the especially in the Black LGBTIQ community. We used to have house parties. I mean, we did go to the bars, but most of our interactions were at house parties. It was at those house parties that the house fathers, who were usually older guys, when I say elder, I don't mean like 60s, 30s, some of them were in their 20s, but they were employed, they hosted parties. That was where you learned about gay sex, you learned about substances, blah blah blah. So we didn't have that big issue back then as much as we do now with the whole issue of overdoses. I mean, you learned about your drugs. Sadly, AIDS took those people from us, and we have not yet created a mechanism to do that same sort of substance training or sexual training within our communities. And to me, I think that's why we're having so many issues, because that was a layer that is missing. And I think it's similar to the layer that indigenous people lost in the sense of their elders in so many ways. So again, that's another similarity between the LGBT, the African community, the African Black and Caribbean community, and the indigenous community. I just want to put that out there. Okay.
Thanks, Colin. And I think you gave a great example of, you know, the importance of like peer-based support too, right? You know, just historically how well it has worked, you know, and then now within the very stigmatizing environment, you know, I think even creating spaces like that can be, you know, difficult. Well, I think agencies and workers, you do often support people who use drugs, but yet, you know, I think another issue is whether you're funded for it or not, right? And we understand how difficult that is, but it's also great to know some of you agencies actually providing those types of supports, even though you're not funded for them. So Wallace, I know you had your hand up. Would you like to speak? Yes.
Yes, I wanted to just mention part of what Colin said. Harm reduction has to do in the African community with family and social connections. And I've heard it say that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connection. And that is true because in West Africa, for example, alcohol is not seen as a drug because it's freely available, it's cheap. People take it, social and traditional occasions require the use of alcohol, but you're not going to see people lying in the gutters, you know, because of alcohol. If you got drunk one night because you drank too much, you laugh over it the next day, and you carry on with your life, you're not going to be a compulsive user. But when these people come to a place like Toronto, where alcohol is regulated, first of all, they are surprised, and then they get introduced to other drugs. I, for example, when I got introduced to substances, the person was an older person, you know, and was actually an older white man in middle ages. And from my background, I would look at such a person as a mentor who, because of the African thing about age, I looked at the person as a mentor, but the person gave me no information at all. And I just used, he just gave me the thing and I used it. And you see, lack of information when one uses drugs, not knowing what you're using and what the effects will be, only leads to a very slippery road, you know? So I just want to say what Colin said. If this had been in a situation where I had connections, real connections, the situation might have been different. I think that drugs are neither good nor bad, but it's the way we use them that matters. And the way we use them is a factor of what we know and who is around us and who supports us. And a lot of Black people are not so used, African people, I would say, are not so used to going to an agency or an institution for help. Help is something that comes from family and friends. So going to an institution for help is a very foreign kind of way of thinking. So maybe we need to find a way that these institutions can act more like the family and friends that they're used to.
Yes, Wallace, you spoke on so many, important points for consideration. I think, like how you spoke about harm reduction is really about, connection. And I would say it's about caring for other people, like from what I know of many, people who use drugs and many, drug culture experts who are, doing such work in the field, they have the heart of gold. It's really, I think, like so many nice people who are actually people who use drugs and so many mean people who are actually, not caring. And you see within the people who use drugs communities that they really look out for one another. And maybe potentially it's because of the need of necessity. But, like I think a lot of times service providers or the mainstream community may just like place these judgments on people who use drugs, and then yet, when you actually are able to see how people who use drugs interact with one another, you see this sense of community there. And, Wallace, you also talked about, like going to institutions could be very foreign experience for people, right? Like if people are not, like used to counseling or, like talking in groups and sharing their very private types of details with others, then how are we able to like make sure that, people still have that opportunity and safer space?
We've lost your audio, Christian.
Yeah, it looks like we may have lost Christian for a sec there, so maybe I can jump in. Maybe I can just touch back on this point because I think it was Wallace that actually mentioned this earlier. You can all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think, Wallace, this is a really important point that the slide is showing right now. I think you mentioned this earlier about how people feel like maybe we're encouraging or permitting drug use. We often hear about harm reduction as enabling drug use. And this comes from someone in the States. I forget who made the original quote, but I often flip that around to people and say, yes, we are enabling people, but we're enabling them to be safe, to be connected, to make decisions for themselves. So I try to flip it back on them when I hear people saying that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Have we lost everyone?
I don't think so.
No.
Okay. All right. I don't know what else we had. I know a big part of what we were going to try and get to today was about the engaging people who use drugs, but I think we will hold that off until next week. We only have 10 minutes left today, and that is such an important piece of the work. We started the whole harm reduction session by saying that, harm reduction programs were everything that we think about today in terms of injection sites, needle exchange, those were all started by drug users before agencies did. And if you, as agencies, are starting to think more about how to engage people who use drugs and developing harm reduction programs, a key piece of that is going to be centering all of that in the experiences and expertise and insights of people who use drugs. But there are a lot of things to be thinking about there. So I think to do that justice, we'll push that till next week. I'm just wondering if there's other people on the call that we haven't heard from yet. Maybe we can hear from some other questions or folks. We just got 10 minutes left. So what are some other challenges that maybe people are experiencing or questions you've got around harm reduction just now?
Oh, Christian is back.
There he is. Christian, I don't know how much you heard, but
okay, we carry on. It's okay. I totally
yeah.
froze. So
can you put the slides back up maybe just to see if there was anything else we wanted to touch on around the harm reduction piece? And then is there anyone else on the call? So we've heard from, you know, Ashley and Colin. We wanted to hear lots from them today. Wallace has said some really good stuff. But are there some other folks? It'd be nice to hear from some other folks if you've got specific questions. Remember, there's no such thing as a silly question here. This is new to a lot of folks. No.
I'm still on.
Nick, if we're waiting, I just wanted to say that perhaps we can have more programs within the agencies that will help people build their connections amongst people that they are comfortable with more. And I think this will go a long way in educating people about drugs, because we can then make use of that platform to educate people and tell them about harm reduction, both about drugs and about sex. Because when we just come out as cold agencies into and be giving out condoms or pipes, it is seen as if we're encouraging. But if we're able to create programs that will engage people and make them connect more, then they will see us more as part of their lives and well-being.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Sometimes we focus too much on the drugs themselves rather than finding other ways to engage. So I used to sit on the City of Toronto drug grants, where it's these, or it's now called the tough grants. And as agencies, some of you probably have tough funding. But that's where we used to fund, you know, drug awareness things and educational stuff around drugs. But realize that actually, if you fund like a cooking class or some other after-school activity, that's what engages people. And then you can embed discussions around drug use within those kind of spaces and environments. The other piece to it, and we'll touch more on this next week, but the involvement of peers and peer networks. So it may be that we rely too much on people coming in to see us and into our agencies, whereas we need to be getting out into community. And there are certain networks of people who use drugs that are never going to step in our doors. But if we can work with people who use drugs, and as Sam touched on last week, you know, Sam has you know, worked with people out of his own home. So thinking about peer networks as well is really important to trying to connect with people in different ways.
The other thing I'm going to point out is that, and we don't do this often enough, is it's how we go about dealing with our communities. We don't look at the key influencers within our communities. So I'm just going to give you an example. You know, if you want to build that community trust, they need to see your presence. So for example, going into the community and just doing like a needle pickup in the area, you know, that way people get to see you and say, oh shit, they actually care, look at that. And that way you can actually talk to people. The other groups that we don't, and I'm just talking about the African, Caribbean and Black groups here, contrary to opinion, barbershops, hair salons are key, critical. Okay, those are the areas where people come and have conversations. And I remember going up to Eglinton West not so long ago and walking along Eglinton West. I mean, between Eglinton West and I forget what the street is. There's like about 10 barbershops. And I remember walking in there and, you know, just having those conversations with those people. And they actually have associations. You know, so it's not like we have to go to every barbershop. We can just actually go and talk to the, to the associations. But, you know, these are the things we need to start doing. We need to be visible within these areas, within these communities, to start building that trust. Nobody's going to come and talk to you if they think that, you know, you are not trustworthy. It's not going to happen. Okay? Simple.
Thank you so much, Colin. And I think, you know, bringing up the barbershop idea is amazing. You know, and, you know, there are these mainstream section, you know, like services out there, but for our community, how can we attract people to come? So I think, for example, I think for the Asian community, we kind of like thought about, oh, maybe like seeing if we can do outreach at bubble tea places. And I think, that's kind of some sort of like outreach that we have done in the past, right? So for different communities, we really need to be innovative and thinking about how can we reach the people where they're at. And I think, Colin, you're also touching on a great point. When we're invisible, then, like just people think we don't exist. So how can we have more folks, like all of you really brave drug culture experts here who are so passionate about your work and being so willing to share your lived experiences and stories and reasons why you do the work. Who else can, be the better ones to do that? Be the ambassadors or be the experts that these organizations should really rely on. Nick, I don't know, I think you said like maybe told the group already next week will be kind of covering the engaging people who use drugs part.
Yeah, I think it's such a critical piece. We hope to get it today, but I don't think it's fair to do it justice right now. I think we really should spend some time going over some of those key principles next week. So if you get a chance to look at our pre-recorded webinar, Ashley was part of that earlier this year. Maybe try and sneak that in before next week. We'll send another email with some other pre-session 3 activities. We'll send that
and
next day
based on the feedback we got from the last session, we know like a number of you had mentioned that you would like more opportunities to interact with your group members. We're still trying to figure out how to do that. We have heard from you. We just want to acknowledge that we're working on that. So for the next session, we'll cover, engaging people who use drugs. We may hear from, I think 3 agencies that express interest to kind of like share the work that you already do in the community supporting people who use drugs, and then probably do some, case scenarios. I'm not sure how interactive that may be right now, but we will definitely have some, good scenarios developed by the drug culture experts for you to kind of engage in some discussions. So
we really do value your feedback. We took a look last week at some of the feedback we got. Kim, in the text, in the chat there, if you're on your phone or computer, hopefully you can look in the chat and there's a Survey Monkey link. So if you could please click that and just give us a bit more feedback. There's a lot to cover here. We're learning as we go and value your input as to how to improve these. So
great, and apologize for the technical kind of like trouble earlier.
Yeah, we'll email this survey link as well as soon as we're done. Thanks, Chaz.
Okay, so with that said, I wish everyone an excellent day. Thanks for waking up early to join us. Next week, Wednesday, same time. But I look forward to all of you joining us and learning with us through sharing knowledge. So thank you so much. Really.
Ashley, I was wondering, Ashley, Colin, any final thoughts? Just we got 1 minute, or just more to say thank you to.
Well, thank you everybody for coming by. It's a pleasure, and hopefully we all sort of learn something. Have a good day and take care.
Yeah.
And if you get a chance to watch that indigenizing harm reduction video, you should watch it. It's beautiful.
Great, thank you, and thanks everyone who shared, including Wallace, Mary, Helen. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Oops, no.
Thanks, Ashley, Colin, Wallace.
No problem.
Again, thanks for your input there. Sam, thank you. We'll connect soon.
Good job, Colin.
Thank you, darling.
Adrian. Hi, Adrian. Sorry.
Hey, Dale.
Hi, Adrian.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.